Gottfried Schadow created an image of winged victory, riding a chariot drawn by 4 horses.
Wunderbar. Danke.
In 1791, it was placed on top of the newly erected Brandenburg Gate. This was once the main entrance to the walled city. Now it's an icon that tells the story of Berlin. Beneath the winged goddess pass the ghosts of a century of troubles. Just like Frederick the Great himself, this building embodies the clash of ideas that define Berlin. It has become a symbol of both militarism and idealism, of oppression and liberation.
Two sides of Frederick the Great's character, the iron fist of rule versus the gloved hand of elegant ideas that could make the world a better place. That was what's driven the history of Berlin. His militarism turned this place into a garrison city of war and oppression. His romantic idealism inspired hopes and dreams of revolution. That is the dilemma which has torn at the German soul.
In October 1836, a student came here to the university. He noticed that the Berliners were ripe for revolution. The student was a tearaway, a hard drinker, a gambler. His name was Karl Marx, a young Prussian philosopher enamored of Voltaire and the Enlightenment thinkers that had inspired King Frederick the Great. Marx's ideas were the beginning of communism.
The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win.
In the Communist Manifesto, Marx urged the workers of the world to rise up against their rulers and establish a classless society. He argued that their loyalty should not be for any country king or president, but for fellow workers the world over. His ideas had an impact on the history of the city and can still be seen on almost every corner.
Traces of social realist art still mark the buildings of the Old East. Communist statues linger, seemingly lost within the reunited city. But streets from both East and West Berlin still bear the name of Marx. And the Karl Marx shop, there's a roaring trade in cut-price goods, sold to the proletariat of the Neukölln district. During the 19th century, the city became known as Red Berlin, a magnet for left-wing intellectuals and activists from all over Europe. In 1871, Berlin passed from the capital of Prussia under a king to the capital of united Germany under a Kaiser. The threat of the communists loomed ever larger to its rulers. But it wasn't until the end of the First World War, as the nation's defeated soldiers paraded past the monumental statue of Frederick the Great, that the people of Red Berlin managed to overthrow their rulers.
On November the 8th, 1918, the anger of the people finally brimmed over. A wave of desperation washed across the country. It was fed by grinding poverty and the sudden realization that the war had been lost. When it arrived here in Berlin, the Kaiser was forced to abdicate. But what filled the vacuum? The simple answer is ideas. Lots of them.
On the day the Kaiser abdicated, not one, but two republics were declared. First by the Chancellor's deputy speaking from a window in the Reichstag, and secondly by the communists. Berlin was plunged into a state of chaos over who actually ruled it. Karl Liebknecht, a lawyer, was a leader of the Communist Party. As a young politician, he'd been imprisoned for condemning Prussian militarism. And when he later refused to fight in the First World War, he was given the job of burying the German dead. He argued with his fellow communist leader, Rosa Luxemburg. If they could only win the battle on the streets, Berlin would be theirs for the taking. As the fighting began to break out, Luxemburg had no choice but to support the coming struggle. Around New Year in 1919, the bloody uprising began in earnest. And by nightfall of the 5th of January, the communists had seized all the important buildings in Berlin, including, symbolically, the Brandenburg Gate. The Chancellor fell back on a very Prussian solution: bring troops into the streets. He mobilized a volunteer army, the Frei Corps, to regain control of the city. On the night of the 11th of January, the buildings of central Berlin were turned into fortresses. It was the first, but by no means the last time that this would happen in the 20th century. The Frei Corps attacked the communists in a bloody battle, winning back control of the Brandenburg Gate and ultimately Berlin. On columns all over the city, the authorities would soon mount a poster campaign quoting a popular poem. The posters read, "Berlin, your dancing partner is death." The prophecy would last almost a century. With the city in their control, the Frei Corps went in search of Karl Liebknecht and his fellow communist leader, Rosa Luxemburg. A tip-off led them to the Mannheimer Straße. This building was surrounded. Both would be interrogated before they felt the rifle butt crash down on their heads. When Rosa Luxemburg came to, she was riding in the back of a car. A man put a pistol to her head and then blew her brains out. The Frei Corps then dumped her body from this bridge into the Landwehr Canal. It crashed through the thin ice and disappeared. As the century progressed, the canal would become the bloodiest channel in a city of deaths. It flooded underground stations during the war, drawing hundreds of drowned bodies into its flow. Later, sections would form the infamous death strip between East and West Berlin. And it's always been a dumping ground for the corpses of dubious killings and political assassinations, among whom Rosa Luxemburg was the first. Karl Liebknecht was also shot, and his body filed anonymously into a city mortuary. The two leaders would later achieve the status of martyrs. But But at the time, their death spelled the end of the communist uprising. Now politicians campaign furiously for a place in a new, broad-based ruling coalition. This government was to move to the small town of Weimar, as Berlin was considered far too dangerous for its politicians.
Next week, in the second part of Dangerous Ideas, how the liberalism of the freshly minted so-called Weimar Republic would encourage a host of new creative ideas in Berlin, but also dangerously destructive ones.
Gottfried Schadow created an image of winged victory, riding a chariot drawn by 4 horses.
Wunderbar. Danke.
In 1791, it was placed on top of the newly erected Just like Frederick the Great himself, this building embodies the clash of ideas that define Berlin. It has become a symbol of both militarism.
The history of Berlin. His militarism turned this place into a garrison city of war and oppression. His romantic idealism inspired hopes and dreams of revolution. That is the dilemma which is torn at the German soul.
Brandenburg Gate. This was once the main entrance to the walled city. Now it's an icon that tells the story of Berlin. Beneath the winged goddess pass the ghosts of a century of troubles. And idealism, of oppression and liberation.
Two sides of Frederick the Great's character. The iron fist of rule versus the gloved hand of elegant ideas that could make the world a better place. That was what's driven